All right, so hello everyone. Welcome to the second Road to JOVED seminar. Today's speaker will be Uphie. Uphie is one of the best judge Indonesia ever have. He has broken in worlds multiple times. He's also the grand final chair of ABP and he judged the grand final of Australs. Uphie's achievement is international in scope. He's a very in-demand adjudicator and today he'll be sharing us some insights on how to be a better judge. So I'm going to be showing your PowerPoint now.
I'm judgmental people, so judgmental judge.
All right, can everyone see?
Yeah, looks good.
Looks good?
Yes.
The PowerPoint is seen. All right, Uphie, whenever you're ready.
Perfect, ready, born ready, so let's do it. Welcome guys, my name is Uphie, as VM has mentioned. I'm going to be talking about adjudicating BP, and this is really cool because JOVED, I was born in JOVED as a debater a long time ago, and that was Australs, and then we moved to Asians, and then we moved to BP right now. So it's been a long journey for JOVED, and I think that all of that journey is made in the sense of making the tournaments, but also the Indonesian scene much more relevant with the goals of debating, i.e. Calibrating ourselves into being someone who's internationally attuned, but also evolving more than just being a good debater, but also being a good speaker, being a good person in general outside of debates. So one of my goals in this particular workshop is hopefully to share some points that would be useful, not just within the debate context, but also for something bigger than that. But definitely, if you are to use these points in international debating scene, that would be very useful for you to take these pointers from this presentation as well. Okay, let's go. Okay, just quick introductions. As PMS mentions, I'm a dinosaur. We can put next 2 times. Yes, best spoken mini tournaments, AdJcore many nationals. Yeah, all of these accolades. More than happy to share a lot of these things with all of y'all, and hopefully that could, that could be useful. No shame and no life. So the structure for this presentation will be as follows. We'll be talking about absorbing the debate, which is very important. We're going to be talking about critical assessment. We're going to be talking about conferral. So this is basically before you start adjudicating, when you start adjudicating, and after you adjudicate, and how do you communicate that with your fellow adjudicators. So that will hopefully encompass all important processes that will need to be done in around 20 minutes amount of time. And finally, recommendations, and hopefully we'll have time for a quick Q&A. 3 notes to make is that number 1, the recommended level for this workshop would be intermediate plus, because I'm not going to be covering BP 101. So not necessarily about speaker's role and how many times speaker have to speak. I'm going to assume that everyone knows how BP functionality at a basic level works. So let's get to it. Number 2, the references for these for points that I'm making would be international BP standards and briefings from the most recent world, from the most recent Asian BPs. So hopefully this will be as relevant as possible. And finally, I'm not going to be discussing about scoring as well. I think scoring is one of the easiest parts of BP adjudication, but most importantly, it's always calibrated depending on the tournaments. So there's no use for me to sort of like create the 75 standard now when you have to adjust later on in JOVED, and then it's different again in other tournaments like NUDC, etc. So for scoring, just note you have to calibrate that per tournament. That's why it's not going to be discussed in this general workshop. Next. Okay, so I'll just start with this note. Adjudicating is a mental tightrope, meaning you have to balance a lot of things. You have to be equally willing to be persuaded by either side, right? But at the same time, you must not be a sheep. You must not be dumb. You must be thorough, right? But you must also be timely, not taking too much time. You must demand burdens symmetrically from all teams. However, these burdens change all the time. So in a subjective world full of movable borders, where everything seems to be contradictory and everything moves, what we have to do is balance. And I think balance will be the theme of many of the parts of this workshop. Let's just keep that in mind. But before we know how to balance, we have to listen, and listen a lot. Next, let's enter the first part of the workshop, and that would be about absorbing the debate, right? So what is absorbing the debate? Okay, so number one about absorbing the debate, let's do next. Okay, what is the definition of an adjudicator? It's actually an average reasonable voter. And notice I say voter, not person, because many people in Indonesia say average reasonable persons. That's outdated lah, because a person usually is a random person on the streets, right? Hanging about. But no, not necessarily. What differentiates a voter and a person, and why must an adjudicator be a voter? Can we press next 3 times, PM? Okay, perfect. So number one is about stepping in. Stepping in, we hear from our coaches, it's a bad word. Do not step in. However, in BP, and especially in many parts of adjudicating, the threshold of step in is also a questionable one. You can ask certain things into the debate, and therefore it's not a big or ultimate no-no to step in all times. Stepping in must be nuanced in terms of its definition, because there are some justifiable ways in which you enter the debate, but not necessarily being unfair. And here's how. Number one is that an average reasonable voter is interested in the topic and therefore in possession of key information about a motion. If you're debating about atheism, if you're debating about US politics, then you know about the key information about the motion. You know about what the motion means. And therefore, when teams misrep a motion, when a team misdefines some things, it doesn't have to be clarified by other teams for an adjudicator to say that's not the right thing to talk about in this debate. Now, I'm going to be talking about this in more specifics, particularly with regards to burdens to the motion, which is the number one burden that's very important in BP. But most importantly, BP is so short. You only have 14 minutes, imagine, as a team, right? If you have to explain everything under the sun, not enough time. And therefore, the threshold of an adjudicator is slightly higher. You can have key information about emotion, insofar as it is not specific information. What is specific information? I know about feminism a lot, for instance. I cannot use my knowledge of Judith Butler's performativity theory to assess whether or not your analysis of first world feminism works. But insofar as you saying first world feminism has no problems accepting Black and Muslim women, I can say that's wrong as an adjudicator, because obviously the second information is key information about emotion that is accessible. But then the first one is too specific. So there's that specificity that you have to keep in mind, which links to the second point. An adjudicator also knows basic general information available in common media, and therefore, if you find things that are naturally wrong, and this easily to be found in New York Times, in Guardian, in Jakarta Post, anything that you read, that's also available to be immediately calibrated by your adjudication. Okay, next. Finally, an adjudicator should also be able to impose basic logical questions. Okay, so an adjudicator is not, can we push next to? An adjudicator is not a blank yeah, it's not dumb person or tabula rasa, and tabula rasa is Italian for blank slate. It's not that you just receive everything that the debaters say, and then as long as it is not responded, then I'm gonna treat it as truth. That's not how adjudicating works. Assume somebody says, well, boycotting a company will lead to companies losing a huge amount of profit, and then that company will change their behavior as soon as somebody starts a boycott. An adjudicator can say, huh, really? How much? What kind of products are we boycotting? How much damage is done to the companies? What kind of changes are done by companies? Or maybe some people say shareholders will correct Jeff Bezos when it comes to bad practices done by Amazon. So we can rely on those other shareholders. And you can say, huh, really? Is it that much amount of people? What are their interests? All of those things. These are basic logical questions that can be asked with regards to how much an argument is persuasive or reasonable. So do ask these basic logical questions. Now, maybe in your mind, you're asking that, maybe then an Uphie is asking adjudicators to allow their personal arguments to color their adjudication and debate. Not necessarily, because then the question is, what is the limit of what the basic logical question and what is a basic information is? And the answer to that is that the limit is a line drawn in the sand. It's always a subjective analysis. Don't impose too much. Don't go to too much details, right? However, basic is allowed. And what basic is, you'll get a hang of it as soon as you have more experiences with judging. But do keep in mind that it's not a big no-no to just impose these basic logical questions. Okay, next. Okay. Number 2, the role of an adjudicator is to listen. Okay, your main job is to listen and not to criticize or coach. So this is something that is also quite problematic because criticizing or coaching, yeah, next VM, can be quite difficult if they are imparted into adjudicating. One second, can we just like pause this for a moment? Sorry. Sorry, 1 second. So sorry for that. Just, smoothing the kinks of not having the presentation with me. Right. So your main job as an adjudicator is to listen. The most common failures in listening include 2 things. Number 1 is misrep. Do note that Bahasa Indonesia is inherently a very imprecise language. We sometimes say, yeah, whatever you say, as long as I get the meaning, it's okay lah. That's how we do it in Indonesian. But English is not. If you say a different word, it means a completely different nuance. If you say it in a different sentence, it means a completely different nuance. If you say may, it's different with might, all of those things. So please do not misunderstand. Please do not try to substitute some words, because when debaters mention factors, examples, numbers, a lot of this is missed because I think I know the big idea. I think I know counterbalance. I write counterbalance and all the details about how counterbalance is being done, who's doing it, all of those details missing. Is that a lot of adjudicators define stepping in as entering the debate and actively rebutting. But stepping in is not just defined as such. Actively refusing to take in some debater's words into your notes is also stepping in. Why? Because you make the active decision to reject these arguments, right? So do put this in mind. Stepping in is not just about entering the debate, it's also about refusing entry. Most times stuff here, that's not important, la, they didn't enough explain it, whatever. Cannot. That's also stepping in. So if debaters mention all of these things, as much as possible, try to listen to them and try to incorporate them into your notes. Okay, next. Now we've talked about an average reasonable voter, and then we've talked about listening being very important. And now finally, how do you prove that you're listening? You note take. That's very important. Why do you need to note take? 3 reasons. Number 1, note taking is important so that you can do a thorough adjudication. It's an evidence you're listening properly, that you didn't miss anything, and it's much easier to later recheck, corroborate, or assess. Okay, because now you have the evidence. Number 2, it creates a numerical justification. Now you can say Speaker A brought 3 points. The first point used 3 factors. The second one used 4 factors or 2 factors or whatever. And then you mentioned 3 countries in explaining the second point, yeah? And therefore it's much easier to sort of justify to the speaker that you're assessing what they said as is. Now, this is important to have numerical justification for several reasons too. It helps to gauge the strength of the argument because elaborating can be about identifying key factors instead of just airtime. Normally, because it's not 4 minutes that point, it's too short to be considered important enough. Not always. A 30-second point can be just as impactful as a said in that 30 seconds, right? But if you don't catch enough of what is said in that 30 seconds, you miss a lot. And that's why it's important to have this numerical justification to help you absorb the debate in all the specificity that one point was given by a speaker. Number 2, it helps speaker feel appreciated as well, because then the speaker realizes that you're taking everything that they say into account and you're making assessment on all of those things. And it helps to just get you better feedback scores. And number 3, it makes it easier to identify what the burdens are for the opposing team, whether or not the responses provided have been sufficed. Because the more you have on your notes, naturally, the more the other team has to say as well. The more factors, the more explanations, the more counter studies that needs to be brought in order to take down that point. Meaning that a response is not enough if a point is explained with many factors and many facets. So numerical justification helps to gauge the initial strength of an argument and also to gauge how much response is needed and whether or not that response managed to take the initial point down. Okay, because not all would take things down, but not always successful, right? And that's why it's important to have numerical justification. Now, finally, numerical justification also helps to counteract your biases. Because if you do numerical justification and if you note take well, this is something that all speakers can access, regardless of reputation, regardless of halo, no matter who they are. You just write down whatever they say, and you can do that, and they can do that. They can speak, right? And sometimes we refuse to write down things because you think, this is not necessarily an important point. That's wrong, because sometimes this is colored by how we see the speaker, right? And this is pretty bad too when it comes to stylistic preferences, manner preferences. You prefer speakers that are more aggressive, you know, if they speak like Sukarno, orator, that's a better speech. Or maybe you prefer speakers who are calmer and all that. Maybe that's a better speech. And that is bias, right? And that's why note take a lot, just so that whatever style is presented to you, whoever the speaker is, you can still get the points and be as objective as possible. So that's the 3 reasons why note taking is important. Next. Then your question is, how do we note take? Notice that note taking is one of the most important skill sets to adjudicate. So number 1, I would advise power note taking. Please do not be lazy. Write everything. I see this from great adjudicators like Nick Long from Cambridge, who once did a PhD or a master's degree study in Indonesia, in Batam. And he literally wrote everything you say, including the filler words. I don't know how he does it, but it's really cool. The other example was Chris Bissett, one of the really good speakers from Australia, from Monash University. He was once here for IDEO. And I realized that it shows that the adjudicator is not just there for the money, it's not just there for the ride, but rather is doing their job seriously. So please take this as a responsibility. You're literally deciding people's, lives and happiness, and people do make a lot of efforts to speak. Take it seriously and take it with responsibility and dedication it deserves. But number 2, please write what is said by the debaters, not what you think it means. Because those can be 2 different things. You can think an argument mean a certain way when you listen to it. And then you take a look at the notes and maybe it's not necessarily quite that, which means misrep, right? And that's why avoiding misrep is if you perform a little bit of a stenographic approach when it comes to your note-taking. Write what is said just so that you can objectively reassess later when you're not in the heat of the moment, rather than what you think it means at the moment. It just helps to counteract your biases that way and check again. Secondly, how to note take better is that use keywords in bullet points. So a good speaker's point is always many factors. Identify which one is the general idea and which ones explain that idea, right? So the big words, and then for example, if a speaker wants to explain happiness, happiness is bad because 3 things. Happiness is short term. Then the big idea is happiness, and the small idea, the reasoning, is short term. And then happiness is bad because it's expensive. Then happiness means big idea, short term, and then expensive being the factor that explains why happiness is particularly bad. This is how you write down in a multifactorial manner. So please use these bullet points to help you guide whatever it is said to support a certain idea, not just the big idea that you write down. Also, good speakers use logical flow. Do not miss a step. We'll talk about logical flow later on. But finally, recommendations, just like really quick ones. Use different colored pens, use different bullet sizes and types, use different papers to have a raw and clean version. And also, most importantly, ask senior adjudicators as to how they note take, because I know that these things are really things that work for me because I like paper-based adjudication. Some other adjudicators like digital adjudication using Microsoft Word or Excel or other apps that you might be more aware of rather than I, because I'm old school that way. So ask senior adjudicators as to how to note take that fits with your style, just so that you can get inputs from them as well. What I mean by all of these things, multifactorial, logical flow, different color pens, why are all of these things so small, and how do they play in a live tournament context? Let's take a look at some examples next. Okay, so this is an example of note-taking. This is what happened in Helsinki Open, one of the first European tournaments that I adjudicated. Actually, this is actually the first European tournament adjudicated, and then I was thrown into a room full of lions. Notice that I have a raw version on the left, and then I have a clean version on the right. It doesn't look clean, but then it's much more, it's much more aggregated, as in what are the topics that fits into a certain theme and all that kind of thing in the right version. So that's number one. You have your notes based on what you hear in the debate, and then after that you put them into their specific boxes. You use different bullet types. And the two things that I'd like to highlight over here is that you use different colored pens. Blue usually for me indicates what was said, and then red indicates my assessment results, my thoughts, because you do have to write and differentiate those two things, right? For example, what was said in this debate is that the speaker has two massive extensions. It's about economic dependence as leverage. This is a motion about Bosnia and Herzegovina, by the way, whether or not the EU has to engage with them. And I have no idea about what Bosnia and Herzegovina means and what the condition over there looks like. So all I can do to assess this debate is just to sort of like listen a lot to the speakers and kind of like absorb as much as possible. And this is from a world's champion. This is from Hadar Goldberg, who won the ESL category of the last iteration of Worlds. And in economic dependence as leverage, why EU should engage with Bosnia, there's 7 points of explanation as to why economic dependence works as a leverage. Workers' employment's being increased. Bosnia actually sells shoes of good quality to EU. Possibility of establishing headquarters in Sarajevo. Possibility of conducting training and education. Number 5, higher wages. If you work as a barista in Starbucks in Berlin, meaning mobility of laborers. Number 6, being able to engage with trade negotiations in Brussels with the EU government. And number 7, actually, Croatia didn't fail when it comes to market integration because the products of Croatia didn't collapse just by integrating with the EU market. That's a lot of points, right? But all of those points explain a bigger points, which is economic dependence. And that's very, very important. Now, this is what I mean by multifactorial. Good speakers don't just explain things in a logical sequence. They explain things with many factors. It becomes very, very, very thick. If you miss some of these factors, then possibly you're missing a key supporter of how that point came about. And that may mean that point sounds less important to you. Not only this is unfair, but this is doing a disservice to that particular speaker's analysis. So don't do that. Take as many points as possible. Now that's only the first extension though. The second extension that the speaker brought was about urgency, why the urgency of EU entering Bosnia is in the form of a waning carrot. Waning carrot means the benefit that the EU can present to Bosnia is disappearing, and happens in 2 big levels, external and internal. Externally, the speaker spoke about how right now China, in form of BRI, Belt Road Initiative, is getting closer and closer into Europe, and we have prevent that from being co-opted. And number two, because of COVID, EU can propose less and less to Bosnia because the benefits and also resources from EU that they can offer to Bosnia is actually siphoned away by the need to handle COVID pandemic. And therefore, if we wait too late, we possibly might not have anything to offer in the recent future. That's only external. Now, internally, the reason why it's quite difficult for us to wait in terms of proposing something to Bosnia is because Bosnia is getting more authoritarian. There's a race for a dictatorship, and also because there is a need for Bosnia to strengthen their country because the surrounding countries are quite of an enemy when it comes to race relations with Bosnia. So there's a lot of explanation with regard to Bosnia's internal changes that prevents EU from being able to enter it later on once that authoritarianism has encroached too far, meaning that's another strong thing. Notice that the big idea is one, urgency, waning carrot, and then it was breaking down to two parts, internal and external. And then internal, it's broken into three parts, external, it's broken into two parts. What if you miss some of these, some of these details? You miss a lot, right? So that's the importance of being able to note-take a lot, because if you miss these key characterizations, then again, misrep, or maybe you don't realize what is actually said, and then ultimately you fail as an adjudicator because then the debaters feel like, why did I spend all of that time explaining that point if you're not even going to write them down? So don't do it. Increase your ability to be able to break all of these things down in a live tournament setting. This actually will be able to improve your the quality of your adjudication. And the reason why I differentiate blue and red is that because I can easily map out what the debater said, and then I can add my thoughts later on in terms of how they react to other teams' points at the end of the speech, just to make a comparison clearer, okay? So that's one way to note-take, and I know that this is an overwhelming example, definitely not gonna happen in most debates, but I think that this is always it's always good to sort of like set up a high standard for yourself when it comes to this. The other example that I like to bring is when I adjudicated KCL, King's College London Open 2020, and this is from an Irish speaker named Jack. And Jack has 1 point, basically. It's a motion about whether or not we should allow the use of slurs to criticize majorities, like Karens, for example, to criticize majority white Americans that are quite dismissive about the need to use masks, yeah? But in terms of explaining that point, he had 8 subpoints. The point is simple. Karens don't like that slur. But the explanation is there's 8. Number 1, Karens will be desensitized. Number 2, they will act defensively. Number 3, they will not support mental health, for example, for men, particularly if it's like a male group that's being criticized by these slurs. Number 4, they will have reciprocal abandon if they hear all of these things. Number 5, they will be more busy justifying self than bettering themselves. Number 6, they will provide less public support in terms of donations. Number 7, there will be an increased emotional gap. And number 8, there will be a state of constant battle and constant warfare that exhausts people emotionally. Same point, 1 big point, but 8 subpoints. And if you miss these things, again, then you lose the key identification of how a certain point is strong. And I noticed this when I adjudicated Hasanuddin BP very recently. It's just last weekend. Speaker also did this strategy, having one massive argument with so many small examples. that explains psychological possibilities of what could manifest when somebody does a certain thing. And all of these key terms are then just like missed by other teams, certainly because other teams are so fixated on responding, which is okay. But as an adjudicator, just don't miss those points, because if you miss those points, then you're missing the key factors contributing to this point strength, and therefore it limits your ability to assess this point properly. Okay, next. Okay, this is another example of note-taking. This is to avoid biases. The impact of this note-taking example is to avoid biases. On the left, we have a grand final notes of Austral's 2020. Notice that in the Prime Minister's speech, the mechanism has 4 different models, which will be useful later on in the debate when the opponent kind of craps on them only using one point in the mechanism. But then there's already 3 other mechanism elaborations that was explained by the Prime Minister. So all the DPM needs to do is that, well, you're not responding to 3 other forms of mechanism. Why was that enough to defeat our case? And as an adjudicator, you say, yeah, that was said. So not enough as a response. That's really important. If you miss these points in mechanisms, then you might realize, maybe that's indeed quite persuasive coming from opposition, and that is probably unfair, right? So yeah, that was pretty strong. And then the Prime Minister continues after 4 different approaches in mechanism with 7 sub-points to explain why her points work. This is a debate about whether or not environmentalists have to work with corporations, and then the explanation were literally 7 sub-points from Prime Minister. It's a lot, right? So all the DPM and the whip needs to do is what? This has been said by Prime Minister, this has been said, not responded yet, and therefore they lose. Really good speech. Now the problem was the DPM continued this trend by saying, they have 5 responses to the key points from opposition, a lot. And then their extension had 7 sub-points as well to explain why the key thing proposed by opposition fails. So this is absolutely thick. And what I noticed from comparing my notes with other adjudicators who are well-ranked in Australs is that they grasped all of these things just the way that I did. So, and we saw the debate exactly the same way. So all of this is really important. Please do not miss a thing when you're adjudicating. Now, the interesting part of this is, notice tone police WOC means that these speakers are women of color that are often said to be shrill or often said to be loud or not speaking in a way that is preferred to certain people. Now, if you don't note-take, you may allow some of your biases to influence your ability to understand the speech objectively, and then maybe buy into the idea that speakers should speak in a certain way, which is unfair, right? And that limits your ability to be fair as an adjudicator. So when we have a lot of biases, let's not kid ourselves. And I have a lot of biases myself. But it's our job always to limit how these biases can influence us. And how we do that is by having a robust note-taking. Now, this happens to in Indonesian adjudicating. This is a note from Hasanuddin BP that I, last weekend from the novice finals. It was by Farah from Undip. Notice she had 3 points in her speech. Number 1 about mitigation, 5 points. It was a debate about whether or not we should prefer day-to-day enjoyment over long-time goals. And then mitigating, how do we prevent long-term goals from being dangerous? You can choose, you can depressurize yourselves, you are rational, you have support system like friends, you can do recreation, 5 points. And then secondly, exclusive benefit. Why is long-term goals better? Because it gives you competitiveness. Simple point. But many explanations under that point. You have to be able to compete with peers. You have to be able to accrue some skills. You have to be able to push yourselves, and that's a good habit. You have to be able to have the desire to improve constantly. You have to remove stagnancy, and you have to learn from your failures, because if you fail, you will still have an additional benefit of learning something. Even if you fail to achieve a certain goal, at least you're going somewhere positive as a net benefit. So these are exclusive benefits. 5 points to explain that. That was very, very thick. And then after that, the third point was about happiness, and this is what I mentioned before. This recharacterization's key arguments coming from the proposition in a way of responding to them at the same time. So it's not just a point about the exclusive material, but it's also something that is directly responsive to the government side of the house. Because they say happiness proposed by the government side of the house is actually bad because it's actually temporary, it's actually expensive, and it makes other people not able to sympathize with our suffering. Fantastic, isn't it? However, this speaker is without reputation. So there is a big likelihood that some adjudicators might not treat this speaker as seriously as that speaker should be treated. And then a lot of these things got missed because this speaker is just not scary enough, or this speaker is not reputable enough, not halo enough, right? And that's not ideal, because we allow other factors outside of the debate to influence how we adjudicate the debate, and therefore we step in, and therefore we are biased, and that's bad. Now, it helps to have these robust note-taking skills, just so that we're not one of those adjudicators who do those biases, and that's why I encourage this to all of y'all. Okay, so that's basically some examples on how to note take and how to do power note taking. Let's do the next on the next 2 slides. Yep, VM, we can next on to, yep. Okay, so I'm gonna be talking now about, after we talk about the role of an adjudicator and how to absorb the debate by robust note-taking, let's talk about critical assessment. And let's start with fallacies. That's the part 1 of critical assessment. Let's talk about what makes our critical assessments fail. And I did end this previous session about note-taking with halo. What does halo mean? This is the most common enemy against fair judging, halo, and this happens in a lot of tournaments. Halo usually pertains to a debater's personal reputation. Oh, because it's, you know, I'm gonna mention some names because they're my friends, okay? So I can say this about them, but oh, it's Rifan, it's Satrio, it's VM, and it's Mel, or it's Jane. They've won classics, IVED, they're IVED champion, they won premiers like ABP or whatever, and therefore their speech must be good. Wrong. Because a good speaker is great, fantastic, but not all the time. And speeches has to be assessed based on what happens in the debate, not based on their initial reputation. So don't let it color your, you know, adjudication too much. Number 2, institutional bias. Oh, it's a powerhouse. Yay, random Pokemon. It's Sydney. Oh, it's Cambridge. It's Oxford. Ooh, they must be a strong team. Not necessarily, because again, not what's in the debate. That's what's before the debate. They may have been good in the past, but maybe in this particular debate, not always the case. And this can affect your decision and scoring, because you tend to give higher score perhaps to those with better personal reputation or better institutional bias, but not necessarily to those without. And that can be very, very unfair. So just note that we have these tendencies. Let's not do it. Number 2, stylistic preferences. Manner preferences happen a lot. For example, in Asia, speakers are generally asked to speak loud, fast, and angry, right? Speakers who speak like this get higher scores. If you speak in a relatively kinder, calmer manner, you're seen as less authoritative. But why, right? This is really, really not necessarily true. But the flip side happens in Oceania or Iona. You have to speak calm, eloquent, and flowery. If you don't speak this way, then you're considered angry. You're considered too passionate and you're considered bad, which is weird, right? Now, notice that there are geographical differences and cultural background differences on this. In an international tournament context, it's so unfair if you allow what you prefer as an individual because you grew up a certain way to color how you assess a debater, because they don't know how you grew up with. They have no control absolutely over all of these factors. So that's not something that should be influencing how you see these speeches. Okay, so let's just check that. Jargon preferences can also sometimes happen. This is something I see a lot in Indonesia when debaters say check and balance, yeah, counter narrative, social contract, so on and so forth. Oh, he said a lot of so on and so forth. He must be a good speaker. Characterization, all of these jargons, immediately you get into these explaining in your head mode. Okay, this point has been explained because I am familiar with these jargons, and that's not a good bias as well, because maybe the debaters aren't necessarily explaining how their mechanism work, or not necessarily explaining what's behind these jargons and hiding behind the big jargons, and therefore playing into your preference for certain styles and words and not the other. Not objective. Finally, stylistic preferences also includes other kind of more pernicious biases like gender. So let's just not allow all of these biases to color our adjudication. Now, can we press next, VM? Because the interesting thing about this biases is that it works both ways. What do I mean by this? What I mean is that sometimes we hate all of these biases so much that we do the opposite. When we see powerhouses, oh, they receive bias a lot, positive bias, so I'm going to adjudicate them harsher this time. Oh, their manner suits me, so I'm going to criticize them harsher. That's also not right, okay? There's positive bias, you like them more because they operate a certain way, and there's negative bias, you like them less because they operate a certain way. Both are not good. So do check both ends of the biases, right? If you prefer certain styles, you prefer certain reputations or not, both can influence your decision, and make a mental note not to allow these things to make you treat teams unfairly, because that's currently really, really bad, and that happens all the time. Notice that this happens not just in certain contexts, it's quite a global phenomenon. So this is something that I think all of us has to work with. But I don't think this just happens in debating. I think this happens in life in general. So I think it's part of our journey to become a better, more equitable individual that checks our biases all the time, right? Because when we step out of debating chambers and interact with other people on the streets, for example, these things can happen as well. So this is a very good life lesson to sort of like learn as well. Next. So after we talk about biases, let's talk about other technical fallacies in adjudication. Number one is assessing time. Oh, speakers over time, it's bad. Or speakers under time must be bad. No, not true. Speaking time should no longer be mentioned in any tournaments, or should not be part of your consideration. Speakers shouldn't be over time, of course, just annoying. But if a speaker is over time, it doesn't mean their speech is bad at all, or it doesn't mean that their speech is worse at all, nor under time. It just doesn't mean a thing. Always focus on contents, okay? Because time is just time. It's like how many minutes are spent in order to say some words. It's not about what they say. It's about how long they need to say it, whatever. Doesn't really matter. So you're not assessing content if you're assessing time. So don't. Number two is focusing on role fulfillment. This is another technical fallacy. A lot of adjudicators say, oh, that's just way too late in the whip. So bye, I'm not going to assess that argument. And that's not good, because maybe that reduces the persuasiveness, because then the speaker has less opportunity to make elaborations and comparisons about why that point should win, but solely on one point being laid or being put in a certain way that you don't think is right does not make that point inherently bad. So always focus on assessing the quality of a point and make that comparative as opposed to just being stuck on role fulfillment beyond everything else. Number two is about the rebuttal argument divide, which means that some adjudicators differentiate between rebuttals and arguments. Fact check, there is absolutely no difference between rebuttals and arguments, none whatsoever. All are points, same thing. One point can contribute to your team while responding to the other team that could do many functions at the same time, doesn't matter, okay? So some speakers say, oh, you're defensive because you didn't have a rebuttal portion of your speech, and too much role fulfillment lah. In many parts of our coaching, in Indonesian coaching, I noticed BP is highlighted to have 50% of role fulfillment assessment, but that is so that we've moved on past that trend, I think. So that's quite an outdated assessment. So let's not do that. Let's focus on content and not technicalities. So these are the two technical fallacies that I like to talk about, which are often about technicalities of a debate rather than just content. Now, in a more content scenario, I'd like to touch a little bit on the last point in this slide, which is about unicorn or doomsday scenarios. What I mean by unicorn or doomsday scenarios is that speakers only want to engage in unicorn, i.e. best case scenario, or doomsday, worst case scenario of certain definitions of emotion or certain definitions of churn or certain occurrences in the society. In a debate about stoicism, which is about having an emotion, but then releasing it in a short amount of time, a speaker says, oh, this will be a world without any emotions at all, and therefore the world will be such a bad place. And that's not right, because stoicism it's not about no emotions. It's about having a short amount of time that this emotion sticks to you. So again, that's a misrep and a doomsday scenario. Number two, highlighting poor people suffering. Oh, this means you're going to exploit poor people in poverty porn. But that's the worst case scenario as to how highlighting poor people suffering can be done. What about writing articles saying poor people are suffering on the street? What about proper videos made with respect? Are you not going to rebut that? That's not right as a debater to do, only engaging with doomsday scenarios. Pornography, for example. Oh, some people are going to coerce women to do pornography, but that's coercion. That's not pornography per se. If somebody consents to doing pornography, is that still bad or not, right? So note, as an adjudicator, doomsday scenario is a policy. Notice that they will be always unlikely persuasive. They only want to engage with the worst case scenario of a certain situation. I noticed this happening a lot, and I noticed that Jason Xiao, when Jason Xiao's doing the BP workshop recently, I think it was in June, yeah, recently in this pandemic, that's the first thing that he said. Always start with the best case scenario of your opponent's point to rebut it, not the worst case ones, okay? Now, in terms of explaining your point, though, many debaters resort to best case scenario, i.e. unicorn scenarios. For example, allowing oppressed minorities to vote. Of course, we're going to allow minorities because people are rational. And that's just wrong because some people are rational, some aren't. When minorities don't have rationality or when minorities vote because they like the person based on their mustache, are you not going to give them 2 votes? Of course not. You're still going to give them 2 votes. So that's not your burden to defend the best case scenario of your minority only. You're defending them as a whole, right? Don't play on unicorn scenarios. An adjudicator should spot that. And finally, any motions about banks and corporations. I see that I hear this all the time. Banks and corporations are nice because they do CSR, which is true. Some are, but many aren't. Are you not going to defend banks and corporations that has more pernicious or questionable practices, right? What I'm saying is that unicorn and doomsday scenarios can capture debates into really, really bad ends of the spectrum. And debates should not happen within that. Debates should be about all parts of the spectrum, about the gradients or about the biggest part of the bell curve, not just the most extreme parts thereof. An adjudicator should not be trapped into the technical fallacy of having to assess unicorn or doomsday scenario in that particular regard. So always avoid yourselves from being from entrapping yourself into these technical fallacies, because this can be really, really bad as well. And the reason why I want to bring this is that because this links to the next particular slide. So VM, we can go to the next. The second part of critical assessment is about burdens, right? Number one in BP, you have a burden to the motion. Now, this is what I mean, why you have to talk about not just doomsday scenarios and unicorn scenarios, because you have to talk about the entire spectrum of emotion. Now, burden number one about the motion is a burden that's often unfulfilled by teams. Most often, this happens in worlds, this happens in international teams tackling the wrong burden, not burden that is demanded by the motion, and therefore they're out of the contention. And this happens to all the many best speakers. So if you do this, don't be too hard on yourselves, because this is quite a common mistake to make. Now, how does an adjudicator avoid this trap? Number one, please notice what the verb of emotion is. Okay, because that's usually the easiest way to identify what the burdens of the debaters are based on the motion. In a motion, this house would invade Zimbabwe. It's not a Zimbabwe debate. It's an invasion debate. When do you invade? What's the standard of invasion first? All of those things. Before those are proven, you cannot jump into Zimbabwe immediately or any specific countries. General first, verb first before topics. Number two, this house as a Catholic church would prioritize impact investing over direct charities to communities. And then some people say direct charity is good. But that's not the debate. The debate isn't about impact investing or direct charity. The debate is about having both, but different priorities, 70%, 30%. Why do we justify 70% over 30% instead of 100% versus 0%, right? Very different. So notice the word. This house believes that ongoing process of decolonization should actively disempower religion that were imposed on the country during colonialism. It's not a debate about religion being bad or being good, obviously not, because the verb is about disempowering religion. How do you disempower religion? Possibly some religions have organizational structure, have influence to the law, all of those things. And this is what we want to disempower. Not that religion is bad, not religion is good. It's not the debate. Therefore, an adjudicator needs to be very sharp when it comes to understanding the verb of the motion. And finally, not all debates require solutions. A team simply has to prove they have less harm or more benefit if the debate does not require them to have a particular solution. Okay, so notice the verb of the motion as an adjudicator. That's very important, just so that you can assess the correct debate, not what the teams might fallaciously want to bring in the debate. Number two, some motions have differentiating items. What I mean by that is, let's take a look at these two motions. This house regrets a toxic positivity culture. Notice that it says culture. What is a culture? That needs to be discussed, right? Culture is usually something that happens a lot in high frequency, a lot of people participating in it. So if teams only talk about toxic positivity being bad or positivity being good, that's possibly not enough. Because if it's good or bad, why does it have to be in a big frequency to the point where it creates norms and cultures? And you have to be sharp as an adjudicator to identify that, just so that if some teams bring it, you realize, these teams answer the burden of the motion better than other teams. Number two, this house believes that educational institutions in developed countries should indoctrinate their children that they're directly responsible for the suffering that happens in the developing world. It's not a debate about whether or not developed countries are responsible for suffering in the developing world, i.e. colonization. It's not, because colonization is bad. But it's about direct responsibility of children currently in developing countries. Where is that direct responsibility coming from? Any teams that provides explanation about where direct responsibility is coming from or not will be able to win the debate, because that's a key differentiating item of the debate. Otherwise, it'll become a completely different debate. And as an adjudicator, you must understand that the motion requires certain teams to talk about certain things more than other things, therefore increasing the level of relevance of certain arguments over other arguments. Finally, it's about actors' interests. This is most pertinent in actor motions. Let's take a look at some examples. This house believes that it's in the interest of organized religion if adherents do not attempt to justify their faith rationally. Some teams will say, well, rational approach to religion allows people to criticize their religion better because irrational means Wahhabism, terrorism, and that's bad. But why is criticizing religion good for organized religion? Because the motion requires you to talk about that particular actor's interest. Why are you bringing a generally good liberal thing, not the interest of clerics, right? Completely different actors. So that's very important to understand so that you know what arguments are less relevant, what's more relevant again. And also, for example, this house opposes the repeal of don't ask, don't tell policy. And then some people say, yeah, we are for don't ask, don't tell, or we want to oppose we want to repeal the don't ask, don't tell policy because it's a discriminatory policy. Good, right? We are against discrimination, but notice that this house is the US. Why is it in the interest of the US military to be anti-discriminatory? Is national security not important for them? And then a team that wants to oppose the repeal says, this debate is not about general community, honey. This debate is about the US military wanting to defend national security and integrity of the military more than anything else. So we're okay to be discriminatory as long as national integrity is being preserved. This is not a foolproof argument. You can rebut it, of course. And I'm not saying that this is a particularly moral argument. I'm just saying that teams have to be a lot more careful in identifying who the actor they're talking about, just so that they're not bringing liberal arguments simply because they feel like it, or whatever argument because they feel like it, and not talking about the specific actor demanded by the motion. And what I'm saying to you as an adjudicator, please notice these things because these can differentiate which teams are performing better than other teams, which arguments are more relevant than others, and you can immediately make a weighing that's very easy based on this part. So do understand that. Number one, burden to the motion must be understood by adjudicators in assessing BP. Next. Burden number two is BOP. I'm just going to go very quickly on this slide because this is easiest to identify. This is basically about how you explain your rebuttals and arguments. And I have mentioned earlier, there's no difference between rebuttals and arguments. I just want to highlight one thing about extension. Any new material can be counted as extension, yeah? So not just only new arguments. Any new points, new responses, new case studies, new string of words, new framing, new way of saying things, etc. Those can be extensions that are valid to be credited from a closing team. So notice that, not just being stuck on, oh, you have to bring a specifically different thing for that to count as an extension. But beyond that, I'm just going to highlight very quickly that there's different ways of explaining BOP. There's logical flow, like one thing leading to another, what leading to another, leading to another, leading to another. This have a tendency to go assumptive. For example, criticizing elites will lead to boycotting companies, and boycotting companies leads to products sold being less, profit of the companies being damaged, and this leads to stakeholders changing their ways. Yay, the world has changed, which is so assumptive because each step has to be explained, right? So notice these things. It's not that you have a longer train and therefore an argument is good per se. Each part of the compartment needs to be explained as well. Secondly, please note as well that some teams explain things in a multifactorial way. They itemize factors that makes an event likely. The examples are available in these slides, so you can take a look at that. And usually the strongest arguments are explained in the combination of those things. One of the best examples of BOP explanation is a speech from Cayman from TCD Hist from Ireland. The argument goes as follows: more than happy to discuss with you after this debate, but just note that some adjudicators prefer logical flow over multifactorial, prefer bigger airtime of explaining things compared to shorter things, and that may not be fair. So if you're an adjudicator that prefers a certain way of explaining BOPs, don't. Notice there are different ways of explaining things. Notice there are logical flow versus multifactorial, all of those things, and then diversify your breadth in terms of understanding how one team can approach fulfilling their BOPs. Okay, so I'll just stop there without going to further details. Let's talk about further details later on, but let's move on to the third burden, which is about the meta debate. And this is something very important, which is in BPs, you can't just prove that your argument stands and is logical. You have to compare them actively with other teams. Why is one argument more important than the other? Why are other teams less important than yours? Okay, it's very, very important. How you do that is in framing. Therefore, debaters ask the question, what's the most important question to ask in this debate? Why is one POV more important than the other? Why is the clash more important than the other? Because you usually take a look at logical prerequisites, right? Oh, in order for this argument to stand, this argument needs to stand first. And because of the chronology nature and the prerequisite nature of that, without proving this, you can't get to this point. Therefore, a team that proves this argument wins over the team that proves the latter, all that kind of thing. And as an adjudicator, it's really, really important to sort of like take a look at these wings, because what your job is to compare, right? And if teams don't fulfill the burden to do meta debate, then that can lead to a tendency of a lot of adjudicators to jump into judgment calls that fits their personal preferences. Therefore, it's important for you as an adjudicator to demand meta debate to be done by teams, to demand framing, just so that you have a clearer, more explicit method of assessing the debate based on what they say in the debate, therefore making your adjudication more objective. Also, this means that as an adjudicator, if teams frame, don't dismiss them. Listen to it, like, is this framing fair? Is this framing factual? Is this correct? All of those things, okay? So that you can use these framings to help and justify your decision in the form of direct comparisons being made by teams compared to other teams, okay? So usually the speaker that is most demanded to do meta debating and provide bias adjudication is whip. Whip speakers in BP, notice, is a reply speaker with response. So their job is to provide a biased oral adjudication, not brutally rebuts. So if you're a whip ever in BP, don't just rebut, because that's not your job. Your job is to provide a biased adjudication. And as an adjudicator, if somebody proposes you a framing, take it and assess it, whether or not that's fair and whether or not that could be used in your comparisons. Because some teams make really, really good framings, and only in framing alone, they can help corner some other teams from the debate, sometimes 2 teams out, 3 teams out, using proper framing. So that's actually a really powerful tool of strategy in BP. And as an adjudicator, you should not just focus on whether or not an argument is explained. Take a look at how teams actively compare as well, okay? That's a third burden to be fulfilled in BP, and therefore, as a judge, please balance these 3 burdens to the motion, the BOP in of itself, and the meta debate in terms of fulfillment to frame. Okay, next. Okay, after we talk about burdens, let's talk about comparisons. When it comes to comparing different points, notice that different points have different values. There's a lot of examples here. Just go very quickly. For example, any mitigatory points will always be less persuasive than exclusive benefit or harm, okay? Because mitigation is about reduction of some other people's persuasiveness. But that doesn't mean that your case is inherently persuasive. There's nothing to buy if you're just crapping on other people, unless it's a really good mitigation, right? So notice that the general rule is mitigatory is less persuasive than exclusive benefit or harm. Number 2, worst case scenario is always, as I mentioned earlier, is always worse than attacking best case scenario. Number 3, uncharitable rendering should naturally be seen as persuasive and sneaky. Uncharitable renderings mean usually going into worst case scenarios and all that kind of thing. People say one thing and then the opponents misrep it or take it to argumentum ad absurdum level, which is so far left field, it becomes absurd. That's usually uncharitable. So don't do it as a debater. And as an adjudicator, when debaters do that to you, notice it and kind of like say, ah, that's not so persuasive lah, because you're only talking about the absurd part of that argument, not the generally meaningful part. And then points that are general in nature, a larger size, higher complexity demography, should be seen as more important than niche ones. I've seen corporations, for example, whether or not corporations should allow those with criminal records to be employed, or rather criminal records to be aired out. And then the government side of the house say people usually do crimes because of economic opportunity, because they're poor, or because of bad decisions when they make when they're young. And therefore, it's important not to allow these criminal records to be known by companies, so that these people are not necessarily additionally punished after they serve their time, right? And then opposition said, no, 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 no. Criminalities are done because people are psychopaths. Like, let's take a look at rapists. Let's take a look at serial killers, which is like, okay, that's true, but it's a very specific subset of the community. And then the proposition's very general. And therefore, the earlier argument is more persuasive than the later argument due to the generality of it, therefore over-encompassing more demographies. Is this always the case, however? Not always, because teams can justify why a niche demography is more valuable to defend. For example, if they have bigger harms, like in the case of rapists, or if they're more vulnerable, and that needs to be characterized and need to be framed as such. But if there is no framing, then what you have to resort is a general rule that a general demography should be seen as more persuasive than niche ones. Okay, different points, different values. Let's take a look at POIs as well. Do not automatically dismiss POIs. POIs can be short, but they can really help to arbitrate close calls, whether or not teams can engage these POIs that are killer. Or if some teams don't accept POIs, that can count to their engagement level as well, particularly when you're assessing diagonals, OG versus CO in particular, or in less pertinent, maybe OO versus CG. If there's a stone wall being built by closing teams refusing to take any POIs, then maybe they don't have any good responses. And therefore, things that are said in the opening half can still be considered to stand simply because closing just did not want to allow opportunities for openings to have any meaningful exchange in the closing debate. And that could really arbitrate if things are closed. So don't automatically dismiss POIs, okay? Now, I've talked about this, about prerequisites. Some points require other points to happen, and therefore the prerequisite takes primacy over the subsequent. But conversely, notice also that some explanations stop before the impacts, and therefore themes that can explain the impact, which is the end part of an argument, the subsequent part of an argument, not the initial one, becomes the winner. It's just about how you justify which one is more important. Is it the chicken or is it the egg? Is it the cause or is it the reason? And there's always different ways of seeing it. But generally, in a logical sequence kind of analysis, things that happen beforehand generally are more important, because you can't really get to another point without necessarily explaining the previous point being standing. And finally, the most important thing to note is that there is a huge preference of philosophical points in certain debates over practical points. And this is a fallacy, because philosophical points and practical points have equal value. Some debates require more analysis on philosophical debates, of course. But some debates also require more analysis on practical impacts, of course. So it depends on the motion too. However, in a general debate where there's equal proportion of the two, don't assume that some philosophical points are automatically more important because they're philosophical than practical ones. Always try to assess them equally as an adjudicator. Okay, so yeah, there's a lot of things going on here. And I know that we're going through this with lightning speed, but more than happy to discuss with them later on and break them down, should you be interested in doing so. Okay, next PM. Now, in terms of comparing, now that we understand different points have different values, what if the points are the same? Let's say exclusive benefit versus exclusive harm. These are same points. So when you have points with a similar nature, what you have to apply is converse burden. And converse burden tenet goes as such. The same question should be asked to all teams. So you can't ask one team a certain question and then waive other teams from that responsibility to answer that question. Usually this is about key stakeholders, solution, benefit, harms, these things of a similar nature, right? What happens in BP is that teams can't decide to go to a completely different direction about something else so meaningful for them that they want to personally talk about if they didn't prove clearly that it's okay to drop the previous exchange. Let's take a look at examples. Parents should be honest with their kids so that the kids become more aware and can have a mature conversation about things. In a debate about whether or not parents should be radically transparent with their kids. And the opposition says, no, kids must be protected from horrible truths because divorce can kill them, disappointments can kill them. Which means that you have an exchange in the opening talking that kids are vulnerable actors. And then suddenly one team says, no, we want to do this because parents will benefit from doing radical transparency. The question is, now why suddenly we shift the debate into parents when kids are clearly the more vulnerable actor? That team needs to justify why the shift in key stakeholder is okay and is good, in fact. Otherwise, if you prefer them automatically, then you're stepping in because you're making the active decision to dismiss other teams from their importances in favor of the team that speaks later. That's not fair, okay? Because you're not applying converse burden. So if the burden is to say kids will benefit from certain things like having more ability to engage maturely or will benefit from being protected, then the other team has to talk about what the benefit is for the kid as well. If they want to talk about the benefit for someone else, justify it, okay? Otherwise, you're not applying converse burden. That's really important to know. So that's how converse burden works. The other example would be, for example, an motion about constituency link about direct democracy on voting local representatives. OG says political parties fail to present local member of parliaments that are accountable and that can be voted out when people don't like them. People's choice are beholden to parties' leadership's whims. So this is not good. And then the opposition says, well, no, not necessarily. There can never be any local issues that are important enough at the national arena. And then you notice, the opposition side of the house is not talking about political parties' role, right? Because government side house clearly says political parties fail to present voters with quality representatives. And then opposition just simply says, whatever, we don't care. Nothing can be important anyway. Meaning opposition didn't prove their burden of talking about political parties. Now, if we favor opposition, then we're not applying converse burden because we're asking different questions to different teams. Not fair, okay? Because then opposition need to address first why political parties can be somewhat adequate to provide representations that fits with people's needs, and then they can talk about something else, just so that they're burdened with the same thing with the government side of the house. And then you can sort of like say, this is how we fairly assess it because we ask all of y'all the same questions, okay? So converse burden, note that it's important to always ask the same question to all teams. Number two, converse burden applies as well in weighing. Converse burden in weighing means that it's important to know to gauge significance, not occurrence. It means when something happens, it does not always mean that it's worse or better, right? Because harms may happen, but they will only be persuasive if the extent and the significance of that harm is bigger than harms or the extent of benefit that will happen on the other side of the house. So the simple question and the approach to this is, what's the delta? And I know that a lot of engineers might hate me for using the word delta, because delta is for delta T and delta D and kind of physical equations, not debate. However, delta is really important because delta is about difference from one point to another, right? Let's take a look at the example of BLM movement. Yeah. For example, if a team says BLM movement is helpful because it can make people cathartic, Black people have been oppressed, meaning the level of them feeling confident is 1 out of 10. And with protests that are violent, now it becomes 7. The delta is what? 6. Yeah. Opposition says, this will reduce support for BLM movement. Bad. And then the government says, well, the support is low anyway. So the support is maybe 2 out of 10 in status quo. And with violence, it becomes 1 out of 10. The delta is 1. What does this mean? This means that the harm happening in the opposition side of the house happens. That's right. But it's less significant than the benefit we receive in the proposition side of the house, because now you're comparing between the accrual of 6 versus the accrual of 1. And that is how you judge significance, not occurrence, because now you're demanding both teams to explain the significance of their arguments. So note that just because certain harms happen or certain benefits happen, it does not mean that they're better than other teams' thingies. Because if that's the case, then any opening teams will lose. Any OG team will lose because they will always be responded by other teams. Not fair, right? You must assess significance just so that you can assess whether or not indeed something is enough to respond, which leads to the second point. A blippy response is not a successful response against weightier arguments. The more weighty a point is, the more weight that the response needs to be, if not more. If a team has successfully explained some things, it's not enough just to respond to it. You must respond it well. That's converse burden, because if one team explains 3 factors to support a certain argument and the other team say, that won't happen because of this. Come on, I mean, that they've provided a lot of explanation in the earlier point and you just say one thing and then everything crumbles down. How is that fair, right? So a lot of adjudicators step into this fallacy of, as long as there is a respond, it's enough. Not true, because that's not how BP works. And if you do that, you're not applying converse burden. You're applying far lesser burden to the response than you do to the initial point that was made by the initial speaker. So that's quite unfair. And this works similarly to just having new points are not enough to make closings win, especially if they're only making beautiful wordings of the same points. So just because someone is having an extension, it doesn't mean they're better than the opening. You have to gauge extents as well. And how you gauge extents and significance, it's by applying the same burden. If a certain team has explained their argument to a significant extent, this much, then the other teams have much shorter explanations to respond to it, then maybe less persuasive. And that's where your note-taking will kick in, because then you can check your notes. There's a lot of explanations provided by the team. Why is the response so short? Why is the response so inconclusive? Why is the response so inadequate? So maybe that's not a good response. So maybe that point still stands. And this can happen a lot. This can happen from OG, like a very strong OG can speak a lot. And then, a lot of other people don't want to listen. It's like, oh, OG is too strong. OG is from ITB. And then I just don't want to respond to them or anything like that, right? And then they're left out. Come on, that's not fair, because you're applying different burdens as if other teams don't have to respond to that argument. So left out usually is a bad judging, because simply because some teams are left out, it doesn't mean that that team is not burdened to explain what has been explained by the other team. So yeah, converse burden is very important just to make sure you have fair adjudication. Weigh everything equally and symmetrically, if that makes sense. Okay, so yeah, that's converse burden. Let's move on to the next and final point of comparison, which is about constructives. in doing constructives. Please. The problem is too often adjudicators take the role as a consultant or advisor. So allowing their preferential views to color their assessment. I would say do not give constructives. Do not, yeah? Your job is to listen, is to assess fairly and compare. You're not a coach, nor should anyone demand you to be their coach. And you should not feel like you should be their coach either, because you're not. If you want to be their coach, you have to propose your services and give your pitch to the teams, but not necessarily giving inputs. Only jot down constructives on your notes when it comes naturally to you. Don't try too hard to find constructives. Do not case build, formulate what you think an ideal case is and expect. Never start an OA with giving general comments. General comments is so 2000 and late. That was really when I started debating, you know, long time ago. Not now. Never start it with general comments unless it's very important to how you determine your ranks. Yeah, that's okay, but very rare, very rare, very rare. Just immediately start with rankings and then ultimately make justify why the rankings being given as such. Unless it's a coaching session, which is usually not what tournaments are. The reason why I highlight this in such a negative manner about constructives is that because a lot of adjudicators seem to have the tendency to want to rebut or give input or kind of like comment on the debaters' points more than they give robust assessment. So then the job becomes warped. Instead of taking what is said by debaters properly and in an equally persuasive manner, and then listening properly, they kind of like have already preconceived thoughts. And these are things that are so out of the factors of debaters. They don't know what's in your head. So if you give a lot of constructives too much in all these things, necessarily, I don't think that would be fair to many debaters. Okay, so, and I feel that especially in Indonesia, the tendency for adjudicators to be demanded to give constructives by adjudicators, for example, or by coaches can distract adjudicators from actually assessing. So you're forgetting the job that takes 80% of your job description for the 20%. Which is an exciting 20% because you feel like you have power and then you feel like you're more smart than the debaters, right? Which taps into the ego of some judges. But don't. If you can't find constructives, you don't have to. If you have to give constructives, general constructives like better framing, or you can give better explanation in these points, or maybe one example I think I could think of, but I can't think of many things else. So you might want to consult on that. And I think that constructives is really important in a pre-Google era when we're debating in 2000 and late, where before Google is available, right? So you can't really get information from many sources because you can't wiki things or you can't really find articles that easily. Now people can just Google whatever they want. So why do they need you to provide all of these chunk of information after they lose or whatever, right? So no, not necessarily needed anymore. And that's why it's quite outdated. Don't focus on constructives. When I go to European tournaments, just like maybe one constructive per team, I do that. And sometimes I don't even know the motion, like Bosnia, Herzegovina, and EU. Other people know better than I, or maybe Balkan young people have to go to the EU to work. I don't know anything about Western Balkan countries, so just ask other judges who are more knowledgeable about these motions. Ask the Edge Core. You can find a lot of inputs there. I can only say that in this debate, this hasn't been explained better. So possibly you can do this better. That's it. For other arguments, you can refer to other people. You can do that totally as an adjudicator. It's completely fine. You don't have to be demanded to be their coach or anything like that. So don't focus on constructives. Okay. Fantastic. So I think we're done with comparison, and I think we are quite on time. So yeah, we can do next PM. Finally, I just want to talk very quickly about the last process after you compare. Yeah, we talk about assessment of burdens, and then we talk about fallacies in critical assessment, and then we finally talked about the how to make comparisons between teams. Now you're done. We're going to be talking about conferring process. Finally, how do we communicate this with other panelists, which is very important as well. Now, in terms of entering the conferral process, I want to break down conferral into three parts. How do you enter it? How do you do it? And then how do you finish it? In terms of entering the conferral process, do two things. Number one, ask a minute or two to consult your notes, yeah? If you need to, take your time. Take this minute to formulate an initial call. And most importantly, and this is something I don't think is done enough, isolate one or two most important points from a team, prioritize in order of why you give this team a winning, not chronological. So when the chair asks you, oh, you give winning to OO, why did OO win? You can't say, oh, OO said A, B, C, D, E, and therefore point C makes them win. No, cannot la. Not enough time. 15 minutes, man. Talk about what's the most important thing that makes OO win. That's one of my failures when I went to Worlds for the first time. I did chronologically, and then the chair kind of like just like, oh yeah, that's a good point, but that's not why OO won. So let's move on to the other parts of the discussion. Then I was just like lost in the heat. So what you have to take is not just the initial call, but also the order of priority, why certain team wins and what's the clincher in particular in that win. So decide that in that minute or two, yeah? Number two, in terms of the entering the conferral, start with your initial call. Do not justify or explain. So initial call usually reads first to CG, second to CO, third to OO, fourth to OG. That's it. Or I give this debate to government bench, maybe more OG than OO, and then opposition, I give this debate to government bench, maybe more OG than CG. Opposition bench, I don't really have a preference. Something like that, yeah? Not necessarily explain, I give OG because they're strong. No, just initial call. Do not justify or explain, okay? It doesn't have to be concrete 1, 2, 3, 4. You can sometimes if the debate is clear, but not being concrete means you're actually giving rooms for other people to differ. And that's a good thing, okay? Number three, you can lean on certain benches, opening, closing, proposition, opposition, long or short diagonal. These are your friends to make comparisons why certain parts of the debate are stronger than the other. You don't have to pick one team only. You can sort of like separate the debates into different parts that are easier to navigate. Number four, this is what I mean. Have a healthy level of interchangeability. For example, I'm quite clear with OG getting first. Not so sure about the other three, so I'm quite undecided at the moment, but maybe OO got second. Something like that is quite healthy. It's not that you don't know what you're doing as a judge, but rather you're open to people giving more inputs and open to achieving the result as a consensus, not because you feel a certain way. And that's very important in BP. Number five, no scoring. Yeah, calibrate later lah. Scoring is quite easy. So don't focus on giving 75, 77, whatever in the initial call before the conferral. It can be decided later. Okay, so that's how you enter the conferral process. Now, after you enter it, how do you navigate it? If you're a chair, you have to moderate. You have to start with the most contentious calls. Which ones are the most different between the judges? If you have a unanimous votes, deprioritize them. Don't think that you don't have to talk about these things. You can revisit them later on, but start with the most different ones. Now, secondly, chairs should ask the members of the panel to explain. For example, let's say the five of us are in the panel. That's VM, Salomo, Axel, and JP. I'm going to say, okay, let's start with VM. Do you want to explain why you give CG over CO? You point out to certain panelists, ask them to explain, not just like, let's start. Who wants to start? Come on, it's not Arisan, bu. You know, you have to make it very clear. The reason why you do that is that it makes the discussion flow so much quicker. And it's also helpful to identify who is most different in the panel. And then that usually is the discussion sparker. And then other people can chime in from that particular differences. So that allows room for the most contentious call to be discussed first, as opposed to other things. And then after that, cut people off when it's too long. Panelists do not feel like you have to speak for too much to explain that you sound smart. You'll just sound greedy if you speak for too long and too much, yeah? So don't feel the need to always explain every single thing under the sun, every single thing that you hear from the debater. It's not necessarily always relevant. Finally, always treat all fields the same. If you feel like you need to invite certain teams to, assess certain teams longer, maybe it's bias. So be careful on that as well. And it's like one final note on moderation, yeah, that I forgot to put in this point, is that please give equal opportunity for all adjudicators, all panelist members to speak, meaning you want to prioritize your questions. Maybe VM, as I asked earlier, will explain CG and CO. Later on CO versus OO, I want Salomon to explain it because that's relevant with their initial call. Later in other kind of things, maybe Axel, what do you think of VM's analysis on CG and CO? Because you have a different call with VM. Do you want to explain why you're different? Something like that. So point to people and make sure you're quite fair in your pointing out, at least in the initial call, just so that you're not seen as a dictator and you don't want to dominate the conversation or anything like that. Or you want to be a dictator, then be a dictator, don't be a judge. Okay, number two, about being topical. It's very, very important in navigating a conferral. And this is something I don't necessarily see in Indonesia much, and I think it should be improved, right? Number one about being topical is stick to precise two teams comparison at a time. If you're comparing OG and OO, let's do that. Let's forget other teams for a second. Let's just compare these two teams and see which one is stronger over the other. Okay, stick to it and then have everyone discuss the same things at the same time. And then if that is resolved already, okay, we are quite consensus in this, let's move on. Now, number two, when you're comparing two teams, identify key points in what was said, usually one or two. So not all of the things that OG said, not OG brought three things, let's discuss them all together. Usually that makes for a very messy conferral process. So let's just, if panelists explain, oh, I heard three things, always ask, what's the most important thing out of those three? And let's start with one. Or as a chair, you can say, okay, you say three, I want to discuss about this point number one, because I think that's most important. Let's discuss point number one. And everyone follows, yeah? With that, you can sort of assess the key priorities of certain themes and then see how other points support or not support that particular key. And then ultimately that helps to navigate the debate in a much more topical way. And then you'll have a clearer consensus at the end of the day, not just, random thoughts about various things all across the globe. And also helps to prevent adjudicators from moving from one point to another, which makes points becoming unaddressed, right? Because if you're moving from one point to another, you're not necessarily getting a consensus on whether or not one point defeats another point. You're just moving around in circles. And this can lead to hours and hours and hours of unproductive conferring, which has happened a lot. So talk about points per points, finish one by one, and then after that, you kind of like can move on to the next point. So if point X is discussed, stick to it, do not go off track. Really, really important in navigating a conferral. Next, if you've navigated all of this swimmingly, fantastic. And the final thing I'd like to say on conferring is please, 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 please be collaborative. Remember, conferral is an exchange of thoughts. It's not another debating arena. Yeah, as much as possible, get a consensus. The preferred ways, I really love this these collection of words by Brian Wong: calibratory, consultatory, confirmatory. You have to calibrate, consult, and confirm, basically, with other people. Notice that missing certain things from your note is very common in BP. It's like 8 persons, 4 teams debate, and you have no room from the whip to moving into the OA sometimes. And sometimes tournament directors right there with you, whipping your ass off and like, make a decision now. So missing certain things are okay completely. It doesn't make you a bad judge. I've once judged a really contentious 5th preliminary top room in an European tournament. And then when we consulted, the chair explained to me something, and that completely, I give a team 3rd, the chair gives the team 1st. And then I explain, and then the chair said, I think you're missing this thing, Upi, because if you want to prove that point, other things must be proven, like financing, and then you're dismissing the financing analysis. And I'm like, I took like my notes, shit, man, bener juga ya. Actually, that's right. I did miss the financial analysis, and financial analysis has been provided by other teams. So you know what? I agree. I will put this team as 3rd because I did miss these things from my notes. And the chair said, fantastic. Okay, that's really good. Okay, let's move on to the next point. So actually, it's fine to admit these things, and it doesn't make you a bad judge, actually. It's just making you a human being, that makes mistakes. And that's why BP is beautiful, because then you can prevent these mistakes from manifesting by checking with other people. So missing something, that's fine. Don't see it as a bruise to your ego or anything like that. It's completely fine. Number 2, do not let panel rankings activate your bias. A story was once about a very legendary judge from University of Indonesia, one of the persons who brought debating to Indonesia, actually, almarhum Perry. And then Perry judged in a human rights tournament with a trainee. Dan trainee-nya relatively lumayan cabe nih. So pretty much not considered as, as trainee, and also quite lackadaisical when it comes to their adjudicating skill. But at that debate, that trainee actually brought a very good point. And Perry says, you know what? That's actually a really good point. So I changed my decision because I'm listening to a trainee. I'm not saying that trainees will always have really good views, but what I'm saying is that don't let panel rankings activate your bias. Just because you're a panelist, just because you're a trainee, just because you're a chair, it doesn't mean that you're reflective of that particular category. It's just because maybe you have a bad day or anything like that. So chairs can be mistaken, trainees can provide great insights. Listen, constantly listen, be genuinely interested in what other people's in the panel have to say, and consider their point of view as well. Is that fair? Is that not fair? Can I be persuaded by that? And you can, if you want. And there's a difference between something is logical and you just don't want to listen to other people and you'll just not be persuaded no matter what. And the second is actually bad. Okay, so that's important. Calibrate and consult and confirm, listen a lot. And when you disagree, formulate them in questions. And this is something I still have difficulties with, but I see that the best judges, particularly from Australia, Lucian Tan, for example, I've judged with world champion Nita Rao, always ask questions. It prompts other panelists to answer instead of just giving statements. So OG explained A, B, C, D, and E. What do you think about how that reacted with the other team? If this stands, don't you think? If the other thing does not stand, all these things. These are really, really good questions, much better than my example earlier, yeah? That actually helps because then it makes people think and invites people to engage other than just say, oh, OG said this, so this is better. It's a statement, it's a wall. And it can create a little bit of a defense sometimes as opposed to an open, collaborative environment. So when you disagree, try to formulate them in questions as much as you can, okay? Those are the best practices that I can encourage you to do in paneling. Now, most importantly, please note that a bad judge is a stubborn judge. It's really bad. Be open-minded, be ready to admit and say, I missed that, it's fine, you actually make sense. And I've seen this from UDC breaking adjudicators who are paneling with me and come like, after the explanation, I did miss that point. So yeah, I'm okay to flip from 3rd to 1st. Quick. And because ya udah gitu, it's fine, right? I've seen this in many kind of and I've done this many times as well. You know, if other people makes points, I'm trying to do that as much as possible. If other people make salient points, why not? Why not change your opinion? That's completely fine, isn't it? Daripada apa, instead of just playing the game of who's more stubborn and who's the most Taurus out of everybody else. Now, most importantly, on stubbornness, justify your splits. You can't just split just because you feel like splitting, okay? Because it's like filibustering. No matter what you say, I'm just going to extend the discussion until 15 minutes is up or until the time expires, and then we will vote at the end of the day. That's not, it's not good, you know. We don't like filibusters in American politics, nor do we like it, or not, nor should it happen in BP judging. And finally, sometimes what I sense is that ego can make somebody behave really in a worst way possible. Was it because of reputation or whatever? I don't know. But rather, I feel like, yeah, they're just not ready to change their opinion no matter what. And that's not usually a sign of a good judge because, again, it's a conferral process. You can achieve a consensus, you can listen to other people, and sometimes you're objectively mistaken, and that's okay. And you can kind of like calibrate that with other people. So don't let ego get the best of you. No one is all that, because usually also good debaters are not necessarily good judges, right? So, and trainees are not always bad. Panelists are not always worse than chairs. Chairs can be mistaken. Just like, remember, we are all human that can contribute to panel. So again, we assess debaters objectively. Therefore, we hear panelists objectively as well. Do not let other things like reputational halo to yourself and how much you love yourself affect how you want to collaborate with other people that you don't see in the same level as you. No. Okay, so yeah, on conferral, those three things: have an initial call to begin with. Number two, navigate it in a way that's topical. And number three, be collaborative. And that's how you approach a good conferring. So hopefully that will help. Next, no, recommendations, just very quickly, I'll finish this point in hopefully short amount of time. Why, after saying all of this, it seems to be a lot, Upi. It's like, why do you ask us to go through all this pain, right? I can just like debate, it's much easier. However, here's why I can recommend judging for all of y'all. Number one, it improves your debating skill very quickly. It makes you understand how to elaborate. What is too much elaboration? What is too few elaboration? What's the sweet spot in between? You understand how to juggle different burdens because you understand from a perspective of a judge that this is what's not complete. And then as a debater later on, you can understand, I haven't explained this, I haven't explained this, I haven't explained this, because as a judge, I would have wanted teams to explain these things, so let's do it. Also, it avails osmosis, which means you can absorb lessons from top rooms. As a debater, normally you cannot, because it's harder to get into top rooms as a debater. And when you do get into top rooms, you're stressed out, right? There's so much pressure. And then you're trapped in that situation of pressure, and maybe that doesn't allow you to sort of learn as much as possible. But as a judge, you're there to listen a lot, and you're not as stressed about the top room, so you're able to absorb more. If that doesn't convince you, ask Bobby, because Bobby can give you all the great reasons as to why debating skills are improved when you are a good judge. So that would be fantastic to ask as well. That's number one. It's about your skills being developed. But number two, good judging also helps you to develop your community, because a proper adjudicator provides proper comments, asks questions. It guides other debaters to a better performance and to a more correct way of establishing debates. Notice that BP is not like other formats. BP is really about strategy, and it's about, like what Julia Bowes from Sydney once said, it's about the economy of language. You have to really prioritize and economize and choose the right things to say in BP, as opposed to choose whatever you want under the sun, because not all things are relevant. And you only have 7 minutes interrupted in your speech with openings and POIs and whatnot. and then 14 teams between the two of you. So you have to really economize. And therefore, good judges can provide what should you let go and what should you keep within cases, because they know how they give these decisions that are justified in other rounds. So that's really important. So you could give inputs that are meaningful. And the problem is many times adjudicators are often intercomp's weakest. Whoever loses the intercomp, they become the N1 judge, they become the one sent to the tournament, or whoever it is who can pay registration, la, cabutan ya. And that's usually a problem, because then we lose the ability to create and develop meaningful judges with meaningful skills. And sometimes converting debaters, good debaters, into judges is not that easy, because those are two completely different skill sets. Debating needs a lot of speaking skills, adjudicating needs a lot of listening skills, and those two can be very, very different in terms of training. So I think it's really worthwhile to take a look at all of these importances and then kind of decide what kind of investment your community and your debating club wants to make when it comes to adjudicators. It's worthwhile to make investments that are much more meaningful to adjudicators. It helps you develop as a community far faster than it is if you're without. I can say that for sure, because I was born from a community of no good debaters, but a very good judge. My coach used to be the DCA of Asian tournaments, probably one of the first Indonesians to ever do that, Norman from ITB at that time. And we haven't really broken when I started breaking in tournaments, but it's because Norman tells us, okay, when I adjudicate NTU, when I adjudicate Ateneo, when I adjudicate NUS, all of the powerhouses of Asia, this is how I adjudicate them. This is what they did. So do it, Upi, do it, all of the kids and whatever. And then I'm like, you know what? Let's emulate that. And then it works. So yeah, good inputs can be provided by strong judges. So worthwhile investments. Next, final slide of this long workshop. Thank you for bearing with me thus far. Finally, how do you practice? Listening, notice, is a learned skill. The more you listen, the more you notate, the more you're exposed to it, the better you're at it. So please expose yourself to high complexity speeches, exchanges, debates, in order to familiarize yourself with speed, terminologies, nuances, right? Because sometimes, I mean, it's literally can be quite difficult in my first years of adjudicating. Like, things go over my head because of many reasons, because I don't understand it, because I'm so, because adrenaline, whatever, right? So all of these exposure trains you. So get to a lot of it. And most importantly, I think that listening is also dependent on your reading. So that you're not in the dark on basic concepts. If somebody say BRI and you think Bang Rakyat Indonesia in a debate about China or in a debate about Europe, possibly it's like, right? Immediately it's like, oh yeah, Belt Road Initiative. It's like, okay, good. And then you can understand that much better than if you don't, familiarize yourself with those topics. So just read a lot. And that works in like debates about financial situations. So I remember a debate about financial crisis, and then teams talk about Enron and bubble. And if you don't know what happened in the bubble situation of Japan in the late 80s, if you don't know what subprime mortgage crash of the 2007 is, if you didn't have any knowledge about Asian financial crisis, at least a basic knowledge of how it works, then all of these things lewat gitu from your head, and that might not do justice to the teams who are trying to explain it using these contexts, because then they have to explain it like you're 5 years old, and they just don't have the luxury of time to do that for you, because they literally are in a crunch time. They only have 7 minutes to speak. If they have to explain all of those contexts while making an argument, chances are they have to dumb down their argument so much that it lowers the quality of the debate. So it actually makes debaters race to the bottom if you're, as an adjudicator, not necessarily are good, because debaters have to pander to the lowest common denominator. And that's not helping for the community as a whole. So the more insightful you are as a judge, the more it allows debaters to experiment with complex ideas with more difficult points, with more nuances that improves the quality of their debate and the debate community as a whole. So it's actually helpful to grow if you know more as an adjudicator as well. Now, finally, I just want to make a note that it's never too old, too big, or too proud to learn. I'm so old. However, there's always new things that happens. Debating and adjudicating right now is so different than it is many years ago when I started. So it's very, very important that it's never too old to learn, let alone too proud. Yeah, pride is just like, pride is if you're waving a rainbow flag. If you're not waving a rainbow flag, then you could be humble. A good debater does not always make a good judge. International tourneys are always great training grounds because it's live, high pressure, cutthroat teams. So it's always really, really good to jump into these international tournaments, especially now they're more available due to online and pandemic context. So that's a silver lining. Understand different styles, priorities, cultural particularities, different communities. This is also important just so that you're not stuck in one mode of understanding debate that is familiar to you. And then you go into different contexts like, whoa, what are people doing? Why is it so different? And there's not the right way to do debates. It's just different cultures and different contexts. So understanding more about these different contexts helps you to sort of expand your horizon as a judge, as a debater, as everything in between, and as a person too, you know, because you understand more people better now that you understand how they think and how they operate and how they speak, and then it makes you wiser in general. And finally, it's just seeking for advice, feedback, comments. Don't be afraid to do that. And this is where I'm promising you that this is not just going to be about debating. This is not just going to be about adjudicating. It's always good to be humble and to be a forever learner, be a kid. I once spoke with a very fabulous British writer named Simon Winchester, who wrote the book Krakatoa and The Machinist, not The Machinist, The Perfectionist. And he said, he's 70 years old and he always writes about this amazing book. And I asked, what's your secret? Why are you so interested in all these things? And he said, never lose your sense of wonder. Never lose your curiosity. Never lose your interest to see how the world works and listening from other people. And that I think is like, that's a really, really cool life lesson, because why is there ever an upper cap to your ability to learn? Why is there always, why do you stop yourself at a certain point when you feel like you're big enough? Maybe you're big enough, but maybe it's a small pond. I don't know. So we can consider all of these things just so that we can be always continue to be interested in new things that can expand our learning. And I keep on doing this because everything just changes all the time. It's so dynamic. And most importantly, it's just also about understanding different communities. Like if you jump from Indonesia to Malaysia, it's a completely different debating culture and debating community and styles, preferences. And then you jump to North Asia, it's so different. India is very different. And then you jump to Iona, and then worlds. My goodness, there's never a shortage of wonders to sort of like learn all of these differences from, and kind of like it makes you just amazed that people do things very differently and kind of see comparisons, not just within debating, but people in general. And if we are to support diversity, I think that's the best way to approach it, by exposing yourself to all these like different things and see they're all equal and they're all valuable, and you can always learn something from that, as opposed to thinking that you're the most correct one simply because you lack exposure. Okay, so on that note, I think I will stop there. Thank you so much for bearing with me. That's how you practice debating. Do listen and do have the interest to learn. Go to international tourneys. Let's decompress a little bit, because a lot of material in this workshop. You don't have to apply all of them at the same time, obviously. So take your time. Pick one takeaway. I think that's the easiest way to do it. Pick one first, implement it, and then when you're ready for next, pick another one, and then all of that thing. I am more than happy to discuss with you at any points in time later on. Just shoot me a message or anything like that. That'll be very exciting. So yeah, feel free to do so, and hopefully this helps. Okay. We're gonna move on to do we have time, VM, for Q&A?
Yes, we do. We do.
Yeah, I don't mind doing Q&A, so let's go. We'll handle 3 in this workshop, and then I'm more than happy to discuss further questions either in the YouTube section of this, because it's going to be uploaded in YouTube, right?
Yeah, correct.
Or via social media, whichever it is.
All right, so if any of you have any questions, you can ask Upi now. We're going to be accepting 3 questions.
Sorry.
If there are no questions, I'm going to start first. So Upi, I'm just curious. If you're someone that is new to judging, how do you start gaining experiences? Because like, for you to be able to judge in tournaments, oftentimes there is a CV demand. You're demanded to already have experiences first, and that's how you can get access to, you know, the better tournaments where you can really test your mettle and upgrade your skills as a judge. But to those people that don't yet have that CV that they can bring to the table, what do you think can be done for them in order for them to be able to access, you know, tournaments to improve themselves or at least improve their judging skills?
Right, 2 things. Number 1 is CV don't happen naturally. CV happens because you network with other people. So it's like a chicken and egg, right? You network first or you build your CV first, whatever. But usually what I would recommend is that you go to tournaments, you jump into the pool, and then you get to know people as judges or as anything else, so that they at least know you and they want to comment with you about debates. They want to share memes with you in social media. You get to know people. And then after that, you can start exposing yourself. And the next time you go into tournaments, you're not necessarily starting from 0 again, because then you accrue all these social capital. So do that a lot. I mean, debating is not just a cerebral game. It's also a social game. You network a lot. And I do learn this from various debaters that are world-class. Victor Finkel, for instance, I think he started his career by doing a lot of observations in worlds, just going there as an observer, and then getting to know a lot of people, and then after that judging, and then after that winning worlds entirely. So obviously the trajectory is not going to be as smooth for many of us mortals. So that can be taken into considerations too, but sometimes providing quality speeches or providing quality judges don't happen automatically, but we can always socialize and interact with people in a meaningful way as friends. So yeah, network a lot. That's number 1. Number 2, my mantra, fake it until you freaking make it. Because one of the biggest breaks that I had as an adjudicator was when Bobby kind of ushered me into a room between IAUM and NUS in UADC 2015 as a single judge in a top room. And I was like, who am I and why am I adjudicating these teams in such an important round, 7th preliminary out of 8, that kind of thing. But yaudah, I have nothing to lose, yaudah. I mean, just like pretend like I'm good. Maybe I don't know. Teams seem to like it. So, but just have that mentality that you're there because you're meant to be there, and just do the best that you can. And sometimes if you have self-doubts too much, you can actually project an aura of lack of confidence that ultimately may make people think that your good judging is actually not so good because you let them perceive it as such. So it's also a game about building perceptions. This is the same thing that I kind of entered when I went to some European tournaments. I mean, these are people who've broken in Euro. These are people who've, yeah, worlds, whatever. And I'm judging them single or maybe chairing. It's like, really? Not necessarily. So if I didn't fake it, then probably I wouldn't be able to convince people that I'm actually good. So fake it. Sometimes you're good not because the quality of you is good, or not just about that. It's about how you convince other people that you're good. So have that game face on, most importantly. And finally, I just like want to add one more note. When you've started building these things, capital, and then you have a game face on and whatever, AdCores tend to test you. Okay, so you go into tournaments and you're suddenly getting good feedbacks, relatively speaking, and you're thrown into upper rooms. This happens to me in Thessaloniki Worlds. This happened to me in Helsinki Open. This happened to me in KCL Open. This happened to me in UADC, right? And that's usually your make or break point when you're tested, adjudicating an upper room. Do you get good feedbacks or not? And you have to be ready getting into that point. So you're going to get these breaks if you expose yourself enough. And then some people try to, okay, let's just say, give you a break. But if you never start, then how do you even get to that point, right? What I'm saying here is that there will be an opportunity to not just break in a tournament, but break it as like a reputable adjudicator. Like that's your big break, almost like a celebrity or like an aspiring pop star. Suddenly people know your name, right? So strive for these opportunities for getting tested in big rooms. And when you are, you'll be able to sort of like utilize that opportunity. And I'm not saying that my judging in all those rooms are good. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, that's depending on the judge, on the debaters to sort of like see it. And I defer to their opinion 100%. But I felt quite confident about these adjudications myself. And it turned out for the better. So I think that these opportunities, you can sort of avail them for yourselves as well. Yeah, so that would be it, VM, if that makes sense. And I think you get your big break in Australs, right?
Yeah. Thank you so much, Uphie, for answering that question. Is there any other question?
I have a question.
Cool.
So Uphie, you mentioned about how regarding points being late, right? I think that you mentioned that you don't believe that any points can be late at all. But like personally, I still kind of buy the reasoning that this point cannot be counted because the other team cannot didn't have the opportunity to necessarily respond to the points. Therefore, a new argument shouldn't necessarily come in the opposition whip, for example. But what's your take on that?
I'm just saying that could be very, very reductive. That could be very reductive to what the point was actually, what was actually said. I'm not saying that you can never penalize a point when they're late, because some points are way too late that it loses persuasiveness because it wasn't explained enough, or it wasn't necessarily elaborated in a way that's proper. So certainly these points can be unpersuasive. It's not an either or, black or white kind of situation. What I'm saying is that there's a tendency for adjudicators to fall back into debating technicalities and speakers' roles because they don't want to engage in whether or not these points are actually meaningful. Because you can't make the argument that even though that was late, that was such a crucial point that it needs to be talked about in the debate, and that has to be awarded to that speaker, right? And you can also make the point that even though that response was late, it's not so unthinkable that the opponent will say that point, to the point where, why did the opposing team not prevent this point from happening early on? Why wasn't there enough or more robust analysis from the other team allowing this late point to be persuasive enough? So maybe the other team isn't that good either. This point is late, okay, sure. But the other team definitely was worse because they allow such a late, short-clipped point to destroy their case. What happened there, right? So that's how you become comparative and nuance the lateness. I find it unappealing when judges simply say, I dismiss it, it's late, I dismiss it, it's late, I dismiss it, it's late, and then not creating these comparative nuances because the permutations are so many. And that's only for if it happens in opposition whip, yeah? What if it happens in the government whip? I mean, I have teams that I given winning to because points happening in government whip saying that, Uphie, why did you give us the win? Aren't those points late? I just say it because as a third speaker, I say it because it's a Hail Mary. Better say it than never. And I'm like, first of all, you're a government whip, so there's still opposition whip to respond to you. So it's not that late. Secondly, your earlier speakers have said these points, so it's not necessarily that new. And thirdly, I mean, if the opposition didn't provide me with enough material, allowing your late material to dominate the debate, then you're not so good, but your opposition is worse. So you still win, right? And that's how you compare. Not falling back on technicalities, because I think technicalities can be reductive to a quality and the exchanges of the debate and not so comparative. That makes sense, Axel.
Yeah, I think it's good. Thank you.
Cool, definitely. So one last question.
I do have a question. Okay, so this is basically more like a technicality question, because when I find, especially in high tension rooms where the speaker are speaking so fast, I find it really hard to take notes. Like you said, I should write everything right. And then I try to write everything. But the thing is, I usually get lost in my own notes, and I really need to make like the points in order to gauge the weight. But somehow I usually just get lost in their arguments, and I tend to have their arguments all jumbled up, and then I find a hard time to differentiate the points. How do I reconcile that?
I think that number one is always to understand which one is the title and which ones are the arguments, or which ones are the factors, right? Differentiating what's the assertion, what's the reasoning. That's why we talked a lot about bullet points earlier, why there's a bigger bullet for the titles and there's different kind of bullets for the factors explaining that title. Like what happened in Farah's speech, for example. The title is simple, competitiveness. And then there's many factors explaining that. And then what happened in Jack's speech that I shared in the picture earlier, the title is simple. Majority won't like slurs. And then the explanation is defensiveness will happen. They will self-justify. They will stop support for other policies. They will not donate, all of those things. So one trick is always to differentiate which one is the title and which ones are the ones that explain that explains the title. Okay, so that's number one. Number two, zoning out can be very, very important. So don't think about the points, just write. Just take notes as you hear it. Write down all of those things after that speech, finish it. I do this often, especially in that Australs debate, where it was like a lot of, I mean, seriously, Prime Minister brought 4 points, mechanism, and then 7 points of substantive, sub-points rather, of substantive. That's one big thing why against corporation is particularly bad if you do a protest. And then after that, DPM brought a lot. So if you kind of like think too much, maybe you'll miss it. So don't think about it too much, just like write down it first. And then after that, you note this from your notes. All of these things actually aggregate into certain cluster. All of these things actually aggregate into certain cluster. And then you can sort of have time to take, to make all these structurings later on. So yeah, do that. Zone out, write first, and then think later. That works a lot, and that actually can make you think, after you read your notes, why, bagus juga ini point gitu lah. Apparently, this is actually a really meaningful point, because then you realize from your notes, now it's a lot. So yeah, that's how you can start doing it. Later on, as you expose yourself to more high-speed speeches, to more high-density speeches, you'll have the knack of understanding where things are actually going. Like what happened in Austral's grand finals, like I immediately, all of these things support that clash. In my mind, it's immediately that. All of these things support that clash, and I kind of like immediately figuring out where things go. Usually it's about motion familiarity too. Usually it's about issue familiarity too. So that would help you to understand as well if you kind of like have a grasp of what the ideas of a certain motion is. And that's why understanding the burden of the motion is important. Because sometimes high density speech and then this is this part is not relevant because that's not the motion. Because that's some of the later debates I adjudicated, that's what happened. It was a high density speech. And then the first half is literally unimportant because it's not the debate. And the second half was important because it was a debate. Because I'm like, the motion states that we have to talk about this. And then you talk about a different thing. Write down, and but then you know that this is going to be a lesser part of your adjudication. And if they don't recover from that, they're doomed. And then they did recover in the second half, but that's 50% of what a speech should be, right? All of those things. So yeah, that could really help navigating it. So in short, how I would summarize is that number one, do have the differentiation between the titles and the factors. Number two, zone out. Write first, structure later. And number three, start with emotion and understanding the basic burdens first, if that makes sense. But it comes through time, Yoshi. So yeah, expose yourself. That came out wrong. I mean, expose yourself to good debates and high density and high speed debates. That's what I mean, just to clarify. I think we can take one more question, Javier.
Absolutely, yeah.
If anyone has it, exactly. If not, that's yes. Go ahead, Salomon.
Listen better gitu.
Oh, we can have both of y'all question. We'll ask. We'll go with Salomon first, and then we'll go with Grace. I think we have time. Yeah, Solomon. So go ahead.
How do you like listen and write better gitu?
How do I what? Sorry.
Listen better and write better.
You practice a lot. You practice a lot, just like listen to a lot of high density speeches. I think reading helps. The more you read, because sometimes reading a lot of these philosophical books or really, really complex explanation about things, you start to realize what's the core idea that they're trying to say, where are they going? So determining all of these is really important. If you know where they're going, like what I just mentioned to Yoshi, you know what the title is, and you know what the supporting factors to explain that title is. So I think that helps to sort of determine, because sometimes it's the uncertainty of where you're going with this speech is what makes you feel lost. Not because you can't listen, but you just don't know where you're going to, or where they're bringing you to. So understanding where they're bringing you to can help you to sort of be more engaged in listening. But other than that, just experience more high density speeches. And I also find this way of kind of structuring my notes only recently, actually, in different debate. When I did UADC in 2015, my notes were completely different than what I have right now. So also experiment with your way of writing things. And I think that as an art student, I can attest to that very, very, very confidently, that sometimes we take not enough attention to how our brains and how our hands actually communicate in terms of communicating these ideas in a visual format. So things are different for many speakers. For me, it's all about the paper and it's all about the different colors. Maybe for you, it's different. Maybe for Bobby, I've never used paper. Bobby uses laptop. I could never use laptop. I miss all things if I use a laptop. So it's different things for different people too. Find what works for you in terms of Manoli say, in terms of writing and jotting things down. And when you find that, go for it and master it. And if you master the art of note-taking that fits for you, it works. And then when you want to change it later in the future, don't be afraid to experiment. That's fine too. But yeah, try to find how your brain and how your fingers communicate to create visual results of those things, because you can kind of like make notes. Oh, ini kayaknya nggak terlalu effective. Oh, I miss certain things if I write this way. Okay, evaluate on that. That's really important. Does that answer, Saloma? Hopefully. Good. So Grace, final question for this session.
How do you structure your final
My what?
The first rank with the fourth rank, or how do you structure it generally?
Oh, so is this for OA or is this for Conferral?
OA, for OA.
Okay, for OA, it's usually different. Usually for OAs, what I do is that I start with the first rank and why that team defeats everybody else, and then moving on down the ranks. It's just easier that way, just so that you don't vilify. I used to start from the bottom and move my way up, but then I find it quite distasteful, because then the fourth team gets all like, oh, you failed this, oh, you failed this, oh, you failed this. So that is quite not nice. So start from the top, I would say, and then make direct comparisons. What I would do is that, okay, let's say CG got first. This is the 3 things that CG said. This is why it won over OG. This is why it won over CO, and this is why it won over OO. Right? So those 3 things: identify what the team you want to talk about. Number 2, identify their key contributions to the debate. Number 3, make comparisons with as many teams as possible. If possible, all 3 teams in the room, and do that for all 4 teams. The benefit of doing that starting from the first is that now you say, oh, CG got first. This is how they win over the other teams. Now understand? Okay, fantastic. All those 3 extensions, great. Congratulations, CG. Let's move to OG as second team. I've talked to you about why OG can't win over CG. Now I'm just going to compare OG to both opposition teams, why OG can't win over OO, why OG can't win over CO. Here's the reason why. You go. And then after that, now we finish with the government bench, we'll move on to the opposition bench. What's the main differentiating factor between OO and CO? Here's the reason. 2 things we heard from OO, let's say, 3 things we heard from CO. Here's the reason. So I think that would have been a great way to navigate an OA, but be comparative. Always make the direct, clear comparison to all teams, and don't be afraid to say they're better. This is better than this is because this reason. One of the failures, like I think I adjudicated with PM, yeah, in our initial pandemic run, because there's a lot of tournaments this pandemic. Almost every weekend I'm in a tournament. I'm like, oh, I don't have any life, really. Yeah, kill me. But initially in those tournaments, what didn't happen was that comparison. So some teams, when I asked the CA, it was Enting at that time, the CA said, oh, they like the comprehensiveness. You heard everything in the debate, that they like it. But when it comes to close calls, it's sometimes not clear how you justify differences between first and second. And you say that it's really close indeed, but it's not clear why first and second win. And I'm like, I think again, oh, you have enough way. I mean, actually, I didn't have a very good reason why first or second, or at least I can only identify the good reason why my justification was correct after the OA, because I didn't focus on comparisons. And that's what happens a lot in adjudication. So always focus on comparing. OG better than CG because, OG better than OO because, CO because, all comparison always, Grace. So if that helps.
Thank you.
Absolutely. All right, so I think that would be all the time that we have for this session. Thank you very much, everyone, for bearing with me for, what was it, like 2.5 hours? Jesus, it's a long time. So thank you so much. I hope it is helpful to a certain degree, hopefully to a greater degree than it is to a lesser degree, but it's up to you. Certainly, I'm more than happy to address any questions. If you still have further ones, don't be afraid to message me via social media or anything like that. I wish all of you the best of luck for your future endeavors in adjudicating, in JOVED, wherever it is that you're going to do. And I'm going to encourage you to, I mean, adjudicating is not just about debating, it's about listening to other people as well. It's about being a better person, I think, because then you can sort of understand better what other people are saying. And I think the reason why I love judging so much is not because I'm a judgmental person, which can sometimes be, you know. However, the bigger pleasure is actually when people say, I feel understood when you judge me. Like, that's exactly what I'm trying to say. And I think that's one of the biggest pleasures in life, at least for me, when I say something and then people don't misrep it, and when people kind of gets it, when people get you. And I kind of like want to have the ability to be able to say to people, I get you, I understand you. Like I hear you. I hear what you have to say. And I think that's very, 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 very important in a world full of people and difficulties and feelings. And sometimes a lot of people have difficulties communicating all of these things, right? So it's not just about them having the burden to say them correctly, but it's also about us being able to listen properly. And I think that's a value of being a human of itself that is often overlooked. So I think it's a beautiful thing when you can listen to other people better. So hopefully that can help us to adjudicate BP better and also listen to other people in a much more empathic and objective way. Thank you very much, everyone. So I return this to VM, and thank you if everyone is watching from YouTube. Good luck for all of y'all.
Thank you so much, Uphie. We really appreciate all the insights that you have been sharing for us. Thank you all for the audience as well. This video will be uploaded to YouTube, so to everyone that will be watching at home, we hope that it can be very insightful to you. If you're interested for more contents like this, do head to our social media at JOVED Online ITB 2020 on Facebook and on Instagram. You can follow us there, and you can get competition updates regarding JOVED as well. All these events are sponsored by Telkom Indonesia, so thank you so much, Telkom. That will be the end. I thank you all and see you at our next edition.